Have you ever heard the saying, steady as she goes? That might be the way to describe a new report out on the value of farmland. Hi, and welcome to the American Farmland Owner Podcast. I'm Dave Price. This week's guest is Paul Schadegg. Paul grew up in western Nebraska. He went off to college in Arizona. Then he came back and he started with Farmers National Company nearly a quarter century ago. Over the years, he's overseen part of the operations in Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, and Wyoming. He's currently Senior Vice President of Real Estate Operations. Now, I mentioned he started his life on the western side of Nebraska. Well, he now lives on the other side in Omaha, and that's where he joined us. And we began our conversation with what's going on with land values. Let's start kind of broadly here. What trends are sticking out to you?
Well, Dave, when we look at what's happened the past 5 years, very exceptional land value increases that we saw that were driven primarily by commodity markets, and the interest rates weren't really a factor during that time, and overall a very healthy ag economy. What that's done to trends today, the difference that we've seen over the past 12 months with increasing interest rates and, of course, commodity markets. Just corn alone is $2 less than it was a year ago. And those pressures have created some new trends as we moved into late 2023, 2024. We saw this settling of land values. And so the trends we're seeing today are continued pressure and the trends downward, especially on lower classes of land, but overall, just buyers kind of stepping back, sellers kind of stepping back and not listing properties because they want to see what's going to shake out here probably over the next 12 months.
What do you make about this? This seems to be a trend maybe in multiple states, but the focus and kind of the sustained value of the higher quality land, that lower quality, that's where it seems like you see the dip. What's going on there?
Yeah, and when we talk about lower quality land, each state can have its version of lower quality land. But when we look at what we'll call the I states, Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, overall in the U.S., that's pretty high quality land. And within those states, we see some suppression, like, I grew up out west where we used a lot of irrigation. And so irrigation wells are important, and water tables and water quality is important. And in the east, we look at farms that may have a little glitch when we talk about drainage and maybe some erosion issues. And so those are the first, what we'll call those lower quality or lower classes of land. Those are the first ones that are going to feel the effect of these pressures, because a buyer can't afford to go in there and invest some money where maybe over the past 5 years, they thought, I've got a little cushion there. I can step in and have it retiled or fix some erosion issues and make it work. So that's where we're seeing the first hit. And if you go farther out west, Colorado, western Kansas, parts of western Nebraska, we're seeing a little bit of suppression in value there because of some drought, 3 years of drought in some cases, some water tables that are really becoming of a concern. Colorado is really looking at some new water regulations. And so that makes a buyer kind of step back and say, "Ooh, I don't know if I want to spend as much as what it's been bringing in the past."
I don't know if this gets outside your purview of some of the things you all are looking into, but in light of the inflationary pressures, and maybe we're going in the right direction ever so slowly here. Interest rates, we keep waiting for those things.
Mhm.
Now it's September, right? We're talking in July, so maybe September this rate decline will finally happen. But can you tell how this has impacted the existing landowners, which for geographical ease, want to expand in one direction, right? You want a contiguous property. That's the perfect way to go, right? If you're actually farming the land. Uh, can you tell at all what kind of impact the higher input costs, borrowing costs, all those kind of things has impacted that?
Yeah, and we've just kind of seen the tip of the iceberg there. And you would, if you step back and you look at it from a farmer, operator farmer, or even a landowner, could be an investor or someone that just wants to expand the operation. Over the past even longer than 5 years, I'll say even 10 years, it's been easy to justify having some emotion in that bidding process. When you have a farmer or a local landowner that all of a sudden their neighbor's farm comes up for sale and they sit back and they think, I've never seen that farm come up for sale in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Now's the time. I've got to make my move here. That's where the emotion comes into play. Or it might be, we've seen this quite a bit in the past several years where it's a local farmer operator that his son is coming into the operation or they're needing to expand to get to a scale that makes sense. And instead of driving 50 miles to farm, I can farm what's right next door. So that causes that emotion and that extra bidding. But I've said this many times that the one thing we can't forget is that there's a reason there's a floor in land values, and you have those non-typical landowners, investors, funds that are willing to bid up to a certain level. So they've set the floor, and then any bidding above market value is going to be emotion, and that's that cushion that those landowners or farm operators are willing to pay. But we're seeing that dissipate a little bit because higher interest rates is an additional cost. Inflation, although there are some inputs that have come back down, overall the input costs in ag are still pretty high, and that's just another cost that they have to consider. And that cushion has kind of dissipated. And the Kansas City Federal Reserve does a great job with analyzing what's the loan demand, what's the demand on lending, and how much cash do operators or landowners in general have in their pocket. And we've seen that widespread of equity that lasted through go back to 2012 till just here a couple of years ago. That spread was very wide, so that meaning they had a lot of equity to spend or that cushion to bid a little bit extra. But I can tell you that those lines have now crossed, and lending is exceeding farm income, and that's going to slow down the buyers for sure.
Interesting to hear you talk about emotion. As you know, when you go into the office and you sit down with your financial planner, that almost invariably that's supposed to be the thing you set aside, right? Other
Mm-hmm.
than maybe the emotion that drives you on, all right, I want the kids to have some money put away down the line. I want grandkids, whatever the heck it is. But I mean, emotion's real, right? And
Mm-hmm.
especially a connection to a physical property like farmland. So you have to kind of acknowledge the existence of it, right?
Yeah. And a qualifier for that emotion is if we look over the past 25 years and what land values have done, and coming out of the 70s and the 80s and the suppression of land values,
Mhm.
and it took all the way through the 90s to dig out of that. But around the year 2000, 99, 2000, we saw some demand, and that's what increased the values. There became more demand for land, and I think there's some that had some cash to spend. And so when we look back across that graph, it's kind of a stair step where we've had a rally in land prices, which usually followed a rally in commodities, and then it would level off, and we'd have this settling period and kind of a new normal, and then it would rally again. And so the justification for that emotion, if you look back at that graph, if you were sitting in an auction and you had a second thought about, ooh, I don't know if I should bid again, and then the vision of that graph came in and you thought, but you know what? It has increased over four and a
Mhm.
half times in the last 25 years. Why would I not? take a
Mhm.
chance. And so that's that justification of the emotion in my mind. That's what I think it is.
Where's your emotion to the land? Because you grew up with it. I
Yeah,
can't
I mean,
imagine that goes away.
yeah, it really doesn't. It really helps me connect, especially in our business. We spend most of our time with landowners, and whether it's in the management or the real estate side of the business. But yeah, growing up, that was my dad's retirement, was my grandfather's retirement, and they really looked to that. We didn't have a lot of cash, but we had equity in the land. And when my grandfather retired and my dad bought him out, that was his retirement fund. And then my dad pretty much financed that, and then unfortunately, I came back from college in the late 80s and early 90s, and it didn't matter how well you operated, it was
Mhm.
pretty tough. And some of those operations just weren't viable, and that's where I ended up, and that's where I ended up working with Farmers National Company. And we owned the farm until just not too long ago, and
Mhm.
sold it when my dad used to always joke, well, if somebody would give me X for the ranch, I would sell it today. And I said, be
Mhm.
careful what you say, because those values keep going up, and someday
Mhm.
somebody's gonna say the right number, and they did. And so he capitalized on that, and that's great. But I've owned farms since then, and that's still probably always in the back of my mind of where I could spend my money. And I'm thinking, wow, I should probably buy some land. And there's just a lot of people that think the same way.
All right, so in your report, you really break it down regionally into different areas, and there's so many factors. We were kind of joking before we started here about, so you grow up in Western Nebraska, so you know Western Nebraska, you know Wyoming, then you go off and get a college scholarship in Arizona, right? So you get to learn the land of the desert out there. So you get a whole different environment out
Mhm.
there. But with each stop, you do get these experiences where you learn about different crops, what works here, what doesn't work here. And your report, the way it isolates into geographic regions here, picks up on different trends here, right?
Yeah. And yeah, and if you go across the country, there are definitely growing season is probably one of the biggest factors that I've kind of discovered through all my years. And uh, Arizona was known for a lot of great research. Well, the reason is because their growing season lasts all year. So you could do research on 3 or 4 crops if you wanted to. And so when I look at Western Nebraska, Northeast Colorado, areas like that, uh, those growing seasons are fairly short. And then you get into Iowa and Illinois and Indiana and regions like that, even into the Dakotas, where the growing season is much better. Soil quality and depth is much better. And so that's where we really see, that's usually where trends start and usually where they finish. And so when we look at like what happens in Iowa, I've quickly decided that I'm going to quit saying that we've seen the last record sale in Iowa or Illinois, because when I say that, then this report just came out about how we're seeing land values start to settle. And then what happens, a little over a week ago, we had another farm that we sold in Iowa that brought 15,000 an acre. And some of that we can attribute to some metro expansion, but overall it's just farm ground that's in high demand, good quality farms that there's still some operators that have maintained a very efficient operation, and they have some cash yet to spend. So there still is some cash out there. There are also investors coming into the market because they're hearing that these land values are settling, and they're thinking, well, I might have an opportunity to hit my ROI if we see land values come down. So we're still seeing that great demand, and it continues to drive, especially in those high quality areas. Illinois is another one where we've seen some really good sales. and there's a little more metro pressures there. I was asked the other day about what do we see when it comes to renewable expansion, and is that causing an issue? In certain areas, yes, where it makes sense, close to a metro area, there's definitely some demand for some development of renewables because it makes sense. The power grid is close, and that works out well. So, but when I look at around, we operate in 8 regions within our company, and when I look out across those regions, there's a lot of similarities, but yet there's some differences, especially when we talk about quality and growing season. Is probably number one.
Well, I'm going to argue that anybody even thinking about selling hopes that you keep getting out there saying that you've hit the limit. If it ends up that they keep getting records, that's what they want to see.
Yeah. And we really look at things from, as a company, we really look at things, as I said a little bit earlier, from a landowner's mindset.
Mhm.
And we get this question a lot about what's on a landowner's mind today. And what's on their mind, I think, is what's going to sustain these record values. And is this my time that I should capitalize on my investment? And the answers to a couple of those questions is that there's a limited supply of land being offered to the market. I think when you go across the industry, most real estate companies, agriculture real estate companies, are saying that their listings are down anywhere from 20 to 25% over the past couple of years when things were really hot. And buyer demand, I mentioned a little bit earlier, there doesn't seem to be a shortage of buyer demand. We've seen some buyers that maybe can't qualify for a loan now, that maybe they've dropped off, but they're being replaced with individuals that don't have a lot of agriculture experience, but see ag, and especially they look at that same 25-year chart that shows the appreciation, and they're saying the same thing, that maybe I should take that opportunity to invest now, and then it'll grow like a stock would, and not just look at annual return on investment, but look at long-term appreciation in land value.
I feel like several months back, maybe these stories were more anecdotal, where you would see an ask not met and the property doesn't move. And it seems like we're hearing that more frequently, but how often is that a thing? Is it still the rarity that that happens, or is it more common?
Yeah, we track that very close and always have. If you
Mhm.
would have asked me 2, 3 years ago, the instance of that happening was less than 5% of our total land transactions. But it's stepped up just a little, but not a lot. And most of that I relate back to what the seller's expectations are, and that we really want to make sure that when we go in as that trusted advisor, that we're giving them a realistic expectation of value. If we are, typically we're successful. If we're pushing the limit, we may see a no sale. But what we also see when we have a no sale is, before we ever shut the door on the auction venue, there's a line of individuals that want to talk about negotiating a successful result. And so most of the time, if there is a no sale, it is put under contract within the next 24 hours, 24, 48 hours. So that's the second part of the equation. So even if you said you had a 5% no sale rate, of that 5%, the majority of them are put under contract, because the sellers want to sell and the buyers want to buy. And so they usually come together.
This might be too hard to generalize, but is it that in these cases, the seller's a little unrealistic, hoping that it was going to keep up, or is the buyer just not willing to go as high?
I think it's a combination of both, but what we
Okay.
usually run into with sellers is that they're selling today and their neighbor sold a year or 2 years ago. And they're like, well, my neighbor's farm brought X,
Uh-huh.
but mine should bring X. but then we have to explain the dynamics are just a little bit different today than what they were. So we have to take that into account.
One of the things I noticed when you're doing regional, when you're looking at the East here with Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, grain prices are such a big factor in that, right? Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I used to say that, and I guess you can still say it that commodity markets are they were the main driver in land values, and today they're probably still a driver, but I think there's other things that are taken into account when we talk about inflation and other negative pressures on the market. But when we look out in that part of the country and you look at basis levels compared to what we are in Nebraska, and that's a big part of why those values hold true year after year there. And productivity is a big part of it, but profitability is the next part of it. And those what they can sell grain for there versus what farther west is definitely an impact.
Are you seeing that, um, for lack of a better descriptor here, for more profitable crops right now? Does that drive buyer interest? Is there anything that you can point to there?
Yeah, there's I was never a big proponent of organics.
Okay.
We had being out west were, less productive crops and less and go back to the growing season part of the equation again. And we saw a lot of failures because of, they were talking about how much more they were going to get paid for a bushel of wheat than the standard market. But when you can't produce as much or you have a train wreck because of weed pressures and things like that, it wasn't a very good operational structure. So, but what we've seen in the past 10, 15 years is with better genetics, better farming practices, we're seeing a lot more in the organic. We have a few clients that's all they want to do, but they have to align themselves with specific operators that know how to be productive in that arena. So we do see that. As far as crops in general, anytime that you can grow seed corn or a specialty crop that you can get a contract for, that's always a great way to go. The disadvantage to that is that those are typically in isolated areas.
What about water? I mean, we see so many more headlines about, you mentioned Colorado
Mhm.
looking at changing the rules there. California's already been going through there, but just frankly, the availability has been, especially as we start looking west and maybe southwest, over the
Yeah.
last 10 years, it seems like we just keep reading headline after headline. So how much of a factor is that playing into buying and selling?
Yeah, and I have a long history with water. Spending my first 17 years with a company as a farm manager in Northeast Colorado, Eastern Wyoming, and Western Nebraska. Like I said, the high quality crops were all irrigated, and we grew sugar beets and corn and dry beans and wheat under pivot. And probably about 25 years ago, called the state engineer in Colorado controls all the water. It's different than from state to state how that's controlled. And they shut off, they had a group called the Groundwater Appropriators of the South Platte. And they determined that that's a time when Denver was expanding and they needed the water. And the state engineer didn't feel that the well users under this GASP group had authority. So they challenged it, lost in court, and they shut off 1,200, 1,400 irrigation wells in a swoop of a pen. So that's kind of a more localized thought, but you're seeing that in California with irrigation water. Same, your demands from population are going to trump demands from agriculture. Agriculture is one of those industries that is very adaptive, and we've seen improved genetics and improved cropping practices to where you can still remain productive as long as you have some water, but in some cases you're losing all the water. And now Colorado's another state where they are looking at further restricting water use mainly from groundwater wells. The surface water has typically has a strong enough ownership that they haven't been able to do much with that. But yeah, and then west, you don't have to go very far, halfway across Kansas, halfway across Nebraska, where water is key to production. And again, agriculture very adaptive. So when they moved water from unlimited use to 10, 12 inches a year, we had farmers back in the mid 2000s that said this will never work. We'll have crop failures, but through low pressure drop nozzles and pivot telemetry, moisture sensors, things like that, they're more productive today than they were then. So we'll continue to see innovation, I'm sure, but we're really pinching that pretty tight.
So are you already seeing, maybe I'm thinking more probably for folks who are on the investing side, not the farmland operators looking to maybe expand next door, but are you seeing it where investors are like, man, that's way too complicated. I don't want to mess with that stuff. Give me someplace safe where I don't have to worry about water. Like, is that frequent?
Yeah, when we've seen that over the past 15 years, we had several investment groups that bought land. In their opinion, land out west was undervalued, and they purchased irrigated farms. And as those restrictions moved in, a lot of those investment groups divested. And where we've seen them move is they went west because they felt like that, and it was a good buy. They surely didn't lose money there. But as that became more complicated and cash rents were harder to obtain at levels that would make sense, now we've seen them migrate towards the southeast. And there's kind of similar things happening in Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia. And we are seeing some of those same groups that we've worked with in the past that are now down in those areas and expanding and in an area where water's not a big issue, and it's just a different culture there that they're having to understand. But other than that.
Okay, so you already talked about the 25-year trend line, going in the right direction here, but kind of the headline of this recent report is basically things are settling, right? So how are you counseling people maybe looking 6 months, year down the road? Settling's better than going backwards, obviously, but they're also looking at that long-term chart going, hey man, I want that back again. So how are you counseling them?
Yeah, so we have to be realistic. And if commodity markets don't see some recovery, and it doesn't appear we'll see some immediate recovery. So we're in this, I don't know if I'd say for the long haul, but I would say we're in this commodity cycle for a little bit here. And so we've got to be realistic. My hope is that we're reaching that plateau and flattening, and my hope is that we reset a new normal, and then whatever factors come into the market and drive commodities to a stronger level, then we might see some more appreciation, and we'll go through another one of those rallies and set another new normal, maybe 5-10 years from now. But the important thing from that landowner perspective is that this is still a really exciting time for agriculture landowners across the U.S. The one thing that I mentioned when a landowner says, I don't know if I should sell or not, the one fact that I can tell them today is that their farm has never been worth more than it is today. There might be some instances where maybe they've dropped a little bit in value, but that's a true statement. When we look back over history, it's just it's never been worth more than it is today. And so when we look at that, as we mentioned before, that very strong demand, there is a huge appetite for agricultural land ownership from individuals, from investment groups, from investment funds. And so there is that supply demand scenario that exists, and that'll continue to sustain some value. How long that can happen without a recovery in commodity markets or profitability, that's going to be the kicker there. But moving in, we'll probably see some real flat markets as we move into the rest of 2024 and already looking into 2025. We'll really be watching the commodity markets, and we'll really be watching profitability to see where that lands.
For better or for worse, you and I are about the same age here, so which means that you've been watching this for a while. As you've seen the industry see more investor types get into it, how does that change what's ahead?
I've spent some time researching, talking with, unfortunately, I couldn't ask my grandfather this because he was already passed, but I had some great uncles that survived the 29 and tough years through that period, where they saw similar instances where non-typical, non-traditional landowners came into play. And usually I hear the same thing, that sometimes it's better to rent the land than to own the land. In cases where there's good profitability, that's probably not the case. But if, especially in today's world where equipment is so expensive and inputs are fairly expensive, to add another big cost in land, you might be better off renting versus selling, and so or buying the land. So definitely seeing a little more of potential in non-traditional land ownership, but the opportunities will still be there for those farm operators to rent that land. Someone's got to farm it, and no person better than those guys.
Right. Hey, we appreciate the look at this. Thank you much.
You bet. Anytime, happy to have the conversation.
He is Paul Schadegg, Senior VP of Real Estate Operations for Farmers National Company. To get that in-depth look at farmland values divided by region, go to our website, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. It's part of our free weekly email newsletter that you can find posted there. It's the place where landowners get their news. Now, you can also sign up and have that newsletter emailed right to your inbox, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.